Hello friends, we are running the series on modern poetry in English, particularly written in the country called England and America, and it also carries the European sensibility in general. In this series today, we have a lecture by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has written a large number of books and articles, and she discusses literature from that particular nearness that we talk about in criticism. And the poet chosen for today's discussion is Wilfred Owen, a writer who was there in the early 20th century, and he was the contemporary of T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats being in fact more senior than Eliot to him. There's a special kind of flavor in this particular in this author because he was a poet of short statement, and he was a poet of perception, and at the same time he was very alert in terms of taking details from life. I have only general view of this, but the specific poetry and its characteristics will be discussed by Professor Payal Nagpal. So then we can carry on some points that she makes and make those points our own, internalize them and make them a part of our understanding. So Professor Payal Nagpal, it is your turn now to take over, and please.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So as Professor Prakash mentioned, that today's lecture will be on the poet Wilfred Owen. And the poem that we are going to specifically look at is Dulce et Decorum est. So, of course, this is Latin, and we'll kind of go into greater detail about this particular poem. It's interesting to note that Wilfred Owen, he was born in 1893 and he died in 1918. So, he died very young. So, he lived for just about 25 years. And in this very short span, his observations about life, his observations about the war, the condition of the soldiers, all that is to be, taken into account while reading, what is referred to as war poetry by Wilfred Owen. So he's known because of this, as a kind of war poet. As a soldier, he had first-hand experience of the trenches and of the trench warfare, especially during the First World War. He initially enlisted in what was called the Artists' Rifles, and he was, he had received a commission in the Manchester Regiment, and later on, of course, he also left for France with the Lancashire Fusiliers. He died just before the armistice was signed, and his experience of the trenches left him, in a situation of what is known as neurasthenia or shell shock. The shelling left a kind of shock as far as Owen was concerned, and he met. And he was, in the hospital, and during this period he met Siegfried Sassoon, and his interaction with Sassoon encouraged him, in a sense, to write poetry that he finally did. He was influenced by W.B. Yeats. Interestingly, Yeats excluded him from the Modern Book of Verse. And his poems were actually included in another anthology, not the one that Yeats had edited, but in another anthology by Edith Sitwell. And except for possibly about 5 poems, almost all his poems appeared posthumously. And the best-selling collections called titled Poems was edited by Sassoon. So the poems, that we really speaking look at, which are very significant, are broadly written from about August 1917 to September 1918, which means that this is really speaking, the time of the First World War. I mean, First World War being 1914 to 18. And it is towards the end of the war that he writes, his understanding of the way in which war impacted human beings. and the attack on 12th January, when the poison gas attack had occurred, that had disturbed him greatly, and he was recovering at the time he was recovering at what is called the Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, and that's where he actually met Sassoon. And he wrote Dulce et Decorum est there in October 1917. And in his letters to his mother, he referred to it as what was called a gas poem. So, Owen, of course, went on to revise the poem much later, but it went through several drafts, and it is, in a sense, critics have associated Wilfred Owen's poem along with, it's like a poetic rendition of Sassoon's protest. Now, in 1917, June 15, 1917, Sassoon had written what was called a soldier's declaration. And I quote, this is a 236-word declaration that was read out in the House of Commons. And he stated, and I quote, "I'm making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." And he says that I'm a soldier convinced I'm acting on behalf of soldiers. And this was a very, very radical position to take. He says, I believe this war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible for them to be changed without our knowledge, and that, has this been done, the objects which actuated us would not be attainable by negotiation. He says, I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolonging those sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. He says that, he was not protesting against the military conduct of the war, but against what he calls the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. So he says that, on behalf of all the soldiers who are suffering, he made this, he protested and said that, this is against the kind of deception that is being practiced, this, unnecessary prolonging of the war. And so this statement was actually read before the House of Commons on 30th July 1917, and it generated, of course, quite a controversy, but it was interestingly quelled by stating that probably Sassoon was under some state of nervous shock, and so he was sent to the Craiglockhart Hospital, and this is where he meets Owen. And so, which is why critics feel that Owen's Dulce et Decorum est is actually a counterpart to Sassoon's declaration, and both take this anti-war position, which is very, very important, and for this reason, the poets of this period are extremely important. I request Professor Prakash to share his views on both Wilfred Owen and on Sassoon's statement.
There's a kind of a dilemma, and you have very, very well, presented it. It is that somebody goes, fights for the war, is a part of the warring group on one side, and realizes in the middle of it that war is being prolonged. And the prolonging of the war is like the shopkeeper prolonging, the phase of profit. So there's some kind of a profit seen in war, which is actually destruction. So I believe this is a remarkable poem, and it's a remarkable statement that inspired this poem, because if people in the House of Commons, and they came from the commonality of England at that time, if they also relate to it, because it comes from a person who is there on the war front, it is going to have a remarkable effect. And I think it did have a great impact, because before 1918, one could not think of the category of war poetry.
Yes.
So it's a war poetry, and it goes against the war, and the stand taken by the poet is that one is talking from within. One knows the reality and one talks about it. It's a very that way cynical kind of situation in which the poet takes the humanistic position.
Yes, the poet takes the humanistic position, and what one probably misses easily is the fact that at that time, to write a statement of this sort, and for Owen to write a statement like write
It's
a
an act
poem
of
like,
courage.
it's an act of courage,
True.
absolutely an act of courage. So if we look at the manuscript of the poem Dulce et Decorum est, so right at the top initially, and before we head there, these are some recruitment posters. Women's from women in Britain say go. Asking the men to go join the forces, and then step into your place. There is a neatness to it all, and there are people with rifles, but then there are other people who are being encouraged to participate in the war and provide their services. Carry what you can, in a sense. So step into your place. And there were many other posters of this kind that showed the soldiers in a very happy and good light, in a sense, encouraging others to participate and join the forces and join the war. Now, if we look at just the first couple of lines here, before that, the first couple of lines of this poem, the dedication, initially was to somebody who had written very heroic war poetry. By heroic war poetry, what we mean is poetry that encouraged people to come ahead, and that was Jessie Hope actually, and Jessie Hope's poems were meant to enthuse people with patriotism and to encourage them to come and participate in the war. And so initially, the dedication, which in the manuscript is then cancelled out, and it is written dedicated to a poetess. So this indicates how what Owen is writing is actually a counter to the kind of war poetry that encouraged people to participate in the war. This poem is a complete counter to that. And in a sense, Wilfred Owen was, of course, taking on writers of this sort who were writing, poetry that glamorized, the whole process of soldiers and their participation in the war. Because if the very first couple of lines of this poem give us an entirely different picture, and Dulce et Decorum est is important because it is not just a counter, but it provides us with a very, very realistic depiction of the soldiers and the pathetic conditions in which they were. So, to just read this short poem. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, cuffing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. So, the moment we look at the first line, it says bent double like old beggars under sacks. So, the soldiers are tired of this war, their backs are bent, and their condition is no better than that of not just beggars, but old beggars who are under sacks. So, this comparison, this immediately totally de-glamorizes the whole thing, totally tells us the very, very realistic way in which, again, what's interesting here is that this kind of poetry, I mean, we are talking about 1917 and so on, and this is the high, time of T.S. Eliot and modernist poetry, where lines are written in a sense that they don't necessarily give the meaning very directly. But here, when we read the lines, the meaning is meant to be conveyed directly. So, this is also very different in terms of style. We can see the use of alliteration, we can see the use of a certain kind of rhyme scheme here. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. So, they are, even when they move towards the rest, they are trudging. They are coughing like hags. So if we look at the meaning conveyed here, we have beggars. The soldiers are compared to old beggars, to hags, and a lot has been said about the use of the word sludge, that it was not simply mud, but it was mud that was combined with a lot of organic matter of people who had died and so on. So the sludge here is not a simple sludge, it's hard hitting. It tells us about the way in which decay was taking place in these trenches. So
Yes. Actually, I'm struck by the choice of words. Earlier, previously, it is sludge, and then the person is trudging through it.
yes,
So that kind of apt phrasing, and it's very economical in terms of language. And even though it's not modernist, it's in fact anti-modernist.
Yes.
Modernists were all the time, talking about the use of economy of words and this and that. But then here is a poet who is using the same kind of terminology to meet the opposite end.
Yes.
That's what it is. And the second thing that you have implied, and I'm just maybe requesting you to also make it clear, wars till the First World War began in 1914, wars were supposed to be fought for some ideals. It was a national ideal. It was and they were the subjects of epics. Most of the
Yes.
actually the entire epic tradition is the celebration of wars, because one is taking up a cause for one's own people against others, who are assailant and all those things. But then here is a war which nobody has is going to benefit from, and everybody is, as you say, bent double and going through it like beggars. So if this is what war is, where is that idealism which was there till the 19th century?
That's a very important point that you're making, because if we compare these first couple of lines by Owen with what Sassoon has written, so the protest statement is precisely about this, that if there was any kind of ideal, so to say, with which they began the war, all that is done away with, and all that is happening now is a prolongation of the war. So there is terms like insincerity and the means that are used. So this kind of prolongation of the war is something that was impacting the soldiers greatly. The use of new methods, the use of the poison gas, the trenches, all this led somebody like Owen to actually question this, to question the whole process of war and the condition of the soldiers therein. So you're absolutely right about this, that that reason, the rationale was probably no longer there, and the soldiers were now like beggars, hags, and they were trudging through the sludge. Men marched, to carry this on, men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots. So, which means that they hadn't had any rest, and as indicated, that they were just trudging. And it also shows these were all young soldiers, but how they had totally aged. I mean, in terms of the years passing, probably just 2 to 3 years might have passed, but they had really aged. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. So, all went lame, all blind. All. There is no exception here. So, all of them have gone lame.
It's
and
a
all of them.
poison gas that is being used.
Yes.
So it will
In
affect
fact,
all
as mentioned, this was referred to as the gas poem. So, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots. So, we look at the rhyme scheme here, in the earlier line, it was boots, and then after another line, then it is hoots. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Now, there's irony here. So, they are drunk with fatigue and they are deaf to the sound of the shelling now, because they have lost their capacity to hear, because their senses have been so deadened by the constant shelling that they can no longer even hear the gas shelling that is taking place. And what is very significant here is the use of the word softly. The gas shelling is anything but softly, but he says
Yes,
that it is dropping softly behind, and they just can't hear it. So Owen is being very, very, he's using sarcasm and irony here. And yet again, we see the soldiers who are absolutely, probably totally divorced from the context in which they are. They are unable to feel, they are unable to experience any kind of, sensitivity. So he says, gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but somebody still was yelling out and stumbling. So they're trying to guard themselves against the gas, but someone is still yelling and someone is still stumbling. Now, a very important aspect, I think, of this particular poem and of, Wilfred Owen's poetry in general is that he gives us a proper picture, a proper portrait in a sense of the soldiers. It's not as if he kind of leaves his portrayal anywhere midway, but he gives us the entire picture of every aspect of, we can just imagine how these soldiers would be trudging physically, what was their condition. We can just totally imagine all of that. And the reference to gas here, gas, gas, and ecstasy of fumbling. Again, there's a lot that critics have said about the word ecstasy. So an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets. So there is obviously no ecstasy, really speaking, in fumbling, and they're trying to, as they try to kind of guard themselves against the gas.
One is to translate into another language, then one would use a word like madness. So there is a kind of rushing, and that is supposed to be ecstasy. Yes. This is the irony you are elaborating, in fact.
Yes, and which is why, in fact, it is believed that Sassoon had probably even put a question mark against the word ecstasy when he had shared this poem about what the ecstasy is, but he is being ironic here. And so he says, and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. So, there is somebody who's yelling out and stumbling. This person is floundering like a man in fire or lime. And so, the person who's probably kind of getting suffocated, is losing it, is floundering as if he were caught in a fire. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. So this use of misty panes and green light, it's all kind of creating the whole picture of the poison gas. And the sea itself is like a green sea. He says, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. So even the whole idea about the use of the poison gas here is something that is detailed and paints this green picture for us. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. So even in dreams, what does the poet see? He sees this helpless sight of somebody who's probably unable to wear the helmet, and somebody who is subject then to that poison gas is in the green sea.
I think you are presenting the aesthetic of war poetry, where something is meant the opposite of what is actually said.
Yes.
And it becomes very dramatic. The kind of distance that is there between the picture and the emotion, that is caught so very well by this poet. I would call him a pioneer of war poetry.
Yes, which takes us actually back to the ecstasy of fumbling, because with ecstasy, is also about survival. That the ones who manage to put their clumsy helmets just in time will survive, whereas the one who is still stumbling, so fumbling and stumbling, are again kind of not just it's not just rhyming, but it's kind of counterposed in a sense to the process of fumbling.
So friends, Professor Payal Nagpal has read out a poem and has also commented on the use of words and the emotion that is captured through them. and this is a different kind of poetry. English is not known for, English writing is not known for generally criticizing the war, and the tradition will begin from Wilfred Owen, and then of course in the 1920s and 30s there will be a spate of war poetry. So this is the beginning of that kind, and Professor Payal Nagpal has already introduced the idea about the First World War leaving this kind of impact on a person who participated in it. So I think we are curious to know more about the poet in the second part of the lecture that will soon begin. Thank you.